In the end, a single assassination, a single moment, a pair of gunshots in Sarajevo had pushed the world into chaos. Empires collapsed, millions died, and the old world disappeared forever. But in the summer of 1914, almost nobody believed such a catastrophe was possible. Europe had become a vast powder keg, and in the end, only 2 bullets would be enough to ignite it, except for a small circle of conspirators quietly preparing assassination plans. Almost nobody realized that Saturday, June 27, 1914, would become the last truly peaceful day before the world changed forever. The countdown toward catastrophe had already begun. In May of 1914, the British diplomat Arthur Nicholson wrote a curious line in his private diary. "Since entering diplomacy, I have never seen the waters so calm." And in many ways, he was right. Despite growing military tensions, expanding armies, and increasingly aggressive rhetoric from generals and politicians, Europe had somehow managed to preserve a fragile balance for years. Crisis after crisis had shaken the continent, yet each time the great powers stepped back from the edge. Diplomats negotiated late into the night. Emperors exchanged polite letters. Foreign ministers traveled endlessly between capitals trying to preserve stability. And surprisingly, often, it worked. So what changed in 1914? In the summer of 1912, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and Tsar Nicholas of Russia met informally near the Baltic coast, surrounded by ministers, officers, and advisors. The atmosphere appeared warm, almost reassuring. The rulers walked together beside the sea, shared meals, inspected military formations, and spoke politely about peace and stability. Their ministers held long conversations deep into the evening. Some even formed personal friendships during those meetings. For a brief moment, Europe seemed capable of preserving its balance. German Chancellor Bateman Hollweg spoke openly with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Saz. Russian officials assured the Germans that their military expansion was purely defensive. Germany gave similar reassurances in return. Both sides calmly insisted that they sought only peace. But beneath the soft, diplomatic language, neither side truly trusted the other. Russian officials privately feared German ambitions. German leaders quietly watched Russia's explosive growth in population, industry, and military strength with increasing alarm. Everyone smiled politely. Everyone lied calmly. And despite the friendly atmosphere, nothing concrete was achieved. Still, even these diplomatic meetings deeply frightened the other European powers. London watched nervously. Paris grew uneasy. Vienna feared isolation. A possible agreement between Germany and Russia threatened to shatter the delicate alliance system holding Europe together. Yet by that point, especially for Russia, there seemed to be no true path backward. The earlier crises of the age, the Bosnian crisis, the Agadir crisis, and the Balkan Wars had all ended without triggering a continental war. But each crisis left scars behind. Armies expanded. Railways were redesigned for mobilization. Military timetables accelerated. Governments quietly prepared for a future conflict that many increasingly believed was unavoidable. Germany, in particular, felt trapped by time itself. Russia's economic growth deeply frightened Berlin. Despite internal instability and political unrest, the Russian Empire continued to expand at an astonishing pace. After visiting Russia in 1912, German Chancellor Bateman Hollweg reportedly returned almost shaken. "Russia grows and grows," he warned privately, "like a nightmare pressing down upon us." German leaders increasingly feared that time was no longer working in their favor. Since 1900, Russia's population had grown by nearly 40 million people. While Germany's population stood at roughly 65 million, Russia was approaching 200 million, and the numbers frightened military planners even more. Russian military reforms projected a gigantic peacetime army by 1917, an army that could potentially outnumber Germany's forces several times over. These fears were not limited to politicians. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff after 1906, believed that a great war between the alliances was ultimately inevitable, and in his eyes, Germany's future enemies were becoming stronger every single year. Especially Russia, a nation with vast industry, seemingly endless manpower, and rapidly expanding military infrastructure. If Germany waited too long, Moltke feared, Russia might someday become impossible to stop, and then Russia itself would choose the timing and conditions of war. For many German leaders, this thought became a quiet obsession. Peace, they increasingly feared, benefited their enemies more than it benefited Germany. Yet Europe still carried on as though war remained far away. Opera houses remained full. Summer resorts welcomed wealthy travelers. Military officers attended elegant dinners beneath chandeliers in candlelight. Across the continent, newspapers still spoke confidently of civilization, progress, and modernity. But beneath the calm surface, anxiety was spreading quietly through every capital. In Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London, leaders increasingly feared that the next great crisis might spiral beyond control. And nowhere did these fears burn more intensely than in the Balkans. The Balkan Wars had transformed southeastern Europe into a deeply unstable region filled with bitterness, humiliation, revenge, and nationalist ambition. Empires feared collapse. Small nations dreamed of expansion. Military leaders saw opportunity. Diplomats saw danger. Austria-Hungary, in particular, viewed Serbia with growing hostility. The Serbian kingdom had emerged stronger and more confident after the Balkan conflicts. Its influence among Slavic populations within the Austro-Hungarian Empire deeply alarmed Vienna. Too many Austrian officials, Serbia no longer appeared to be merely a small Balkan state. It appeared to be an infection spreading slowly across the empire's southern frontier. And among the loudest voices warning of danger stood one man, General Konrad von Hitzendorf. Again and again, Konrad demanded preventive war against Serbia, against Montenegro, against Romania, even against Italy. To him, delay only made Austria weaker, but not everyone agreed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, feared that a major war could destroy the fragile empire completely. He distrusted Serbia deeply, yet he also understood how weak the Habsburg monarchy truly was beneath its imperial appearance. The empire was divided by language, ethnicity, religion, and political rivalry. A large European war, he feared, might tear it apart forever. And so, while generals spoke openly of military solutions, diplomats still struggled desperately to preserve peace. But by 1914, peace itself had begun to feel temporary, fragile, artificial, as though Europe was sleepwalking toward something terrible. And somewhere far away from the royal palaces and diplomatic salons of Europe, a small group of young men quietly prepared themselves for murder. Most were barely adults. They carried pistols, bombs, cyanide capsules, and they believed history itself was waiting for them. Around this same time, another figure stood quietly near the center of Europe's growing tensions. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Those who encountered him in public often remembered the same unsettling impression. A large figure, heavy shoulders, cold eyes, a stern expression that rarely softened. He seldom smiled. He almost never laughed. Even in photographs, he appeared tense and distant, as though carrying an invisible burden that never truly left him. Observers later recalled that he lacked warmth in public settings. He rarely displayed enthusiasm, even during ceremonies designed to inspire admiration or affection. At theaters in Vienna, he would sit silently in his royal box, barely reacting to the performances before him. While others applauded musicians and actors, Franz Ferdinand remained motionless. Many people who met him left with the same strange feeling. He seemed deeply uncomfortable with the world around him. And yet, beneath that cold exterior existed a man shaped by years of humiliation, frustration, and isolation inside one of Europe's oldest imperial dynasties. Franz Ferdinand had never originally been expected to inherit the throne of Austria-Hungary. The succession crisis began decades earlier. In 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf, the son of Emperor Franz Joseph, died tragically at Mayerling. His death shocked the empire and left the future of the Habsburg dynasty uncertain. After Rudolf's death, the line of succession shifted toward Franz Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig. But when Karl Ludwig died in 1896, Franz Ferdinand suddenly became heir presumptive to one of the largest empires in Europe. The responsibility transformed his life forever. Yet Emperor Franz Joseph never truly liked him. The aging emperor viewed his nephew as stubborn, difficult, emotional, and dangerously independent. And over time, tensions between them only deepened. The greatest conflict emerged because of a woman. Her name was Sophie. Sophie came from an old noble family, but she was not considered equal to Europe's ruling royal houses. According to the strict traditions of the Habsburg dynasty, she lacked the dynastic rank necessary to marry the future emperor of Austria-Hungary. To Franz, Joseph, and the imperial court, the relationship was unacceptable. When the emperor first learned of Franz Ferdinand's intentions, he reacted with fury. To many members of the Habsburg family, the Archduke's decision represented more than romance. It felt like rebellion, a challenge against centuries of imperial tradition. But Franz Ferdinand refused to surrender. He loved Sophie deeply, and unlike many aristocratic marriages of the age, theirs was said to contain genuine affection and emotional closeness. Eventually, after years of resistance, a compromise was reached. Franz Ferdinand would be allowed to marry Sophie, but only under humiliating conditions. Their marriage would be officially declared. Sophie would never share her husband's rank, titles, privileges, or inheritance rights within the Habsburg monarchy. Their children would never inherit the throne. At official ceremonies, Sophie would walk behind lesser-ranking nobles. During formal state occasions, she was often excluded entirely. Even at royal events, she was treated almost like an outsider. At times, it seemed as though the imperial court wished to remind her constantly that she did not truly belong. The humiliation wounded Franz Ferdinand deeply, and over time, it changed him. He withdrew further from Vienna's glittering, aristocratic world. He avoided many social functions and increasingly distanced himself from the imperial court. The couple found comfort mostly in private family life. Many historians later believed this isolation contributed to Franz Ferdinand's growing bitterness toward the aristocracy surrounding him. Yet strangely enough, the isolation also strengthened his independence. In 1906, Emperor Franz Joseph appointed Franz Ferdinand Inspector General of the Armed Forces. The role dramatically increased the Archduke's influence within the empire. For a man who loved military affairs, organization, and travel, the appointment provided both freedom and purpose. It also allowed him to spend more time traveling beside Sophie, away from Vienna's suffocating court politics. And during this period, another important figure entered Franz Ferdinand's world more closely than ever before. General Konrad von Heitz. Konrad was one of the most influential military minds in Europe. Brilliant, intense, restless, but also deeply unstable. In 1906, he became chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. Throughout his career, Konrad argued relentlessly that the empire's enemies had to be confronted through force before it was too late. To him, war was not merely possible, it was inevitable, and delay only weakened Austria-Hungary further. Yet behind his fierce military confidence lived a troubled and emotionally fragile man. Konrad frequently struggled with depression and self-doubt. After the death of his wife in 1905, these emotional struggles became even more severe. At times, he considered resignation. At other times, he threw himself obsessively into work, strategy, and dreams of military glory. And eventually, another obsession entered his life: love. Konrad became passionately attached to Gina von Rattinghaus, the wife of a wealthy Viennese industrialist. The relationship consumed him emotionally. In private letters, his language toward Gina became almost desperate. He dreamed constantly of becoming a celebrated war hero capable of overcoming social barriers and scandal through military glory. Over time, love and war became strangely intertwined in Konrad's mind, and nowhere did his obsession burn more fiercely than in his hatred of Serbia. Again and again, Konrad warned that Serbia threatened the survival of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. He viewed Serbian nationalism as a dangerous force capable of inspiring Slavic populations throughout the empire to rebel. By the end of 1907, Konrad openly recommended invading and annexing Serbia. He described the kingdom as a center of conspiracy and agitation. During the Bosnian crisis of 1908-1909, he urged Vienna to launch preventive war against Belgrade. During the Balkan Wars, he repeated the same demands. And throughout 1913 and early 1914, he continued pressing for military action almost obsessively. At times, he called for war dozens of times within a single year. Yet strangely enough, Franz Ferdinand himself often opposed these reckless military adventures. Although the Archduke distrusted Serbia deeply, he also understood how fragile Austria-Hungary truly was beneath its imperial appearance. The empire faced enormous internal problems: ethnic tensions, political divisions, nationalist unrest, economic inequality. Franz Ferdinand feared that a large European war might destroy the monarchy completely. So, despite his friendship with Konrad, the two men increasingly disagreed about the future. Konrad viewed the army as a weapon meant to fight. Franz Ferdinand viewed it as a tool for preserving internal stability. Their relationship slowly deteriorated, and by 1913, their disagreements had become openly hostile. At one military meeting, Franz Ferdinand reportedly humiliated Konrad in front of senior officers after troop movements had been changed without authorization. The incident deeply damaged their relationship. By the spring of 1914, Franz Ferdinand had quietly decided something important. After the upcoming military exercises in Bosnia were completed, Konrad would likely be removed from his position. Neither man could possibly know how little time remained. As Europe drifted quietly toward the summer of 1914, diplomats still attended banquets beneath chandeliers. Military bands still played in crowded squares. Train stations remained full of travelers beginning their summer holidays, and far away from the royal palaces of Vienna. In the restless Balkans, a small group of young conspirators quietly prepared themselves for murder. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. The city rested beneath soft summer sunlight. After several days of rain, the skies above Bosnia had finally cleared. Warm light reflected gently across the Miljaska River, and the streets slowly filled with civilians hoping to witness the arrival of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. To many observers, it seemed like an ordinary royal visit, but beneath the calm atmosphere, something terrible waited quietly in the shadows. For Serbian nationalists, June 28th was no ordinary date. It was Vidoveden, St. Vitus Day, one of the most emotionally significant days in Serbian history. Centuries earlier, on that same date in 1389, Serbian forces had been defeated at the Battle of Kosovo by the Ottoman Empire. Over generations, the battle transformed into a powerful national symbol of sacrifice, suffering, and lost glory. And now, on this deeply symbolic anniversary, the future ruler of Austria-Hungary had arrived in Bosnia. To radical nationalists, it felt almost like an insult, especially after the recent Balkan Wars, where Serbian nationalism had grown stronger and more confident than ever before. Across the Balkans, nationalist groups dreamed of uniting Slavic populations beneath Serbian leadership. And among the most dangerous of these movements stood a secretive network connected to Serbian extremist circles. Some members called themselves Young Bosnia. Others operated through shadowy nationalist organizations like the Black Hand. Most of them were young, thin from poverty, illness, hardship, but they carried enormous anger inside them. In the days before Franz Ferdinand's visit, several conspirators quietly entered Sarajevo in small groups. They carried pistols, bombs, cyanide capsules. Each man understood that the mission would likely end in death. Some expected to be shot immediately. Others planned to swallow poison after completing the assassination. And yet, despite the danger, many appeared strangely calm. They believed history itself was waiting for them. On the morning of the visit, the assassins spread themselves along the Apel Quay beside the river, the exact route the Archduke's motorcade would follow through Sarajevo. Some stood near bridges, others blended quietly into the crowds. One by one, they waited. Meanwhile, Franz Ferdinand and Sofia appeared surprisingly relaxed. Security preparations for the visit were shockingly weak, although Austrian authorities had received warnings that an attack might occur. The royal couple still traveled through Sarajevo in an open automobile with very little military protection. No long lines of soldiers guarded the streets. No major security barriers separated the crowds from the convoy. And Franz Ferdinand himself disliked excessive precautions. In the days before the visit, he and Sophie had walked openly through public areas with minimal concern for danger. At one marketplace in Sarajevo, Gavrilo Princip himself had reportedly watched the couple moving calmly through the crowd only days before the assassination. Even local officials expressed concern. Some quietly warned that tensions among Serbian nationalists were extremely high during Vidoveden celebrations. But Franz Ferdinand dismissed many of these fears. He wished to appear calm, confident, unafraid, and perhaps most importantly, June 28th also marked the wedding anniversary of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. Sophie had insisted on accompanying her husband during the Bosnia visit despite the dangers and political tensions surrounding the trip. As the motorcade slowly moved along the river, crowds gathered on both sides of the street. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Flags fluttered gently in the warm morning air. People waved. Some applauded politely as the open car passed by. Then came the first moment. One of the conspirators, Mohammed stood waiting near the Kumarija bridge with a bomb hidden beneath his clothing. As the Archduke's car approached, panic suddenly overwhelmed him. For several seconds, he froze completely. He later claimed that someone nearby startled him at the crucial moment. Whatever the reason, he lost his nerve. The convoy continued forward untouched. A short distance later stood another conspirator, Nedeljko Vabrin. Unlike Mehmed Bazik, Vabrinovia acted immediately. As the royal car approached, he struck the detonator of his bomb against a metal surface and hurled it toward Franz Ferdinand's automobile. The attack nearly succeeded, but at the final second, the Archduke's driver accelerated slightly, and the bomb bounced from the folded roof of the car before exploding beneath the vehicle behind them. The explosion tore through the street. Smoke filled the air. Metal fragments scattered across the road. Several officers and civilians were badly wounded. Chaos erupted instantly. Yet even after the attack, Franz Ferdinand remained remarkably calm. Witnesses later recalled his composure during the confusion. Meanwhile, Vabrinovia attempted suicide. He swallowed cyanide and jumped into the Miljaska River, but nothing went according to plan. The poison was old and ineffective. Instead of dying, he became violently ill. And because the river was shallow during the summer months, he barely landed in enough water to cover his ankles. Police officers and furious civilians quickly dragged him from the riverbank and beat him savagely before arresting him. At this moment, many believed the danger had passed, but the remaining conspirators were still waiting along the route. Franz Ferdinand himself now faced an important decision. Many officials urged him to leave Sarajevo immediately. Instead, he insisted on continuing the official program. "It seems the man has lost his mind," the Archduke reportedly muttered after the bombing. "Let us continue." The convoy proceeded toward Sarajevo City Hall. Along the route, the remaining assassins watched nervously as the cars approached. Yet one after another, they failed to act. Some lost their courage. Some panicked. Some hesitated because Sophie sat beside her husband. For several brief moments, it almost seemed as though fate itself protected the royal couple. At City Hall, the atmosphere became tense and chaotic. Officials attempted to continue the formal welcome ceremony despite the bombing that had just occurred. Franz Ferdinand interrupted the prepared speech angrily. "I come here as your guest," he reportedly declared, "and I am greeted with bombs." Yet even then, he refused to abandon the visit entirely. After the ceremony, he insisted on visiting the wounded officers at the hospital. The route was changed. Or rather, it was supposed to be changed. And this small mistake would alter the history of the 20th century. As the motorcade departed City Hall, one of the drivers accidentally followed the original route instead of the newly planned one. The cars turned onto Franz Joseph Street. Suddenly, officials realized the error. General Oskar Podiorik shouted that they had gone the wrong way. The driver stopped. The automobile carrying Franz Ferdinand and Sophie began slowly reversing in the middle of the street. And standing only a few feet away, outside a small delicatessen shop, was Gavrilo Princip. For Princip, the assassination had already seemed like a complete failure. Now, suddenly, almost unbelievably, the Archduke's car stood motionless directly beside him. History had returned to his hands. Princip reacted instantly. Unable to reach his bomb quickly enough, he pulled out his pistol instead. At close range, he fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second tore into Franz Ferdinand's neck. For several seconds, many nearby still did not fully understand what had happened. The Archduke and Sophie remained seated upright inside the car. Then slowly, Sophie collapsed toward her husband. Blood spread across Franz Ferdinand's uniform. Witnesses later recalled his final desperate words, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." The car raced toward the governor's residence beside the river, but there was little anyone could do. Sophie died first. Franz Ferdinand lost consciousness soon afterward. By 11 o'clock that morning, both were dead. As news spread through Sarajevo, church bells began ringing across the city, and slowly, across Europe, shock spread through royal courts, military headquarters, diplomatic offices, and newspaper rooms. At first, many people believed the crisis would eventually pass. After all, Europe had survived so many crises before. Another Balkan conflict, another assassination, another diplomatic confrontation. Surely the great powers would find a way to preserve peace once again. But this time was different. The alliances were tighter, the armies were larger, the fears were deeper, and perhaps most dangerously of all, many leaders had quietly begun believing that war might now serve their interests better than peace. Within days, diplomats would begin preparing ultimatums. Generals would study mobilization schedules late into the night. Railways would prepare to transport entire armies across Europe. And slowly, almost sleepily at first, Europe began walking toward the First World War as church bells rang across Sarajevo on the morning of June 28, 1914. News of the assassination began spreading rapidly across Europe. Telegrams moved from embassy to embassy. Military officers received urgent reports. Royal courts awakened to whispers of tragedy. At first, however, very few people understood what the murders would truly unleash. To most observers, the assassination appeared to be another violent Balkan crisis. Shocking, certainly, but not necessarily will. Europe had survived similar crises before. The Bosnian crisis, the Agadir crisis, the Balkan Wars. Again and again, the great powers had approached the edge of war, and then stepped back. Many believed this time would be no different. But beneath the calm public reactions, something had already begun to shift. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph received the news at his summer residence. The old emperor was 84 years old and had ruled Austria-Hungary for nearly 7 decades. He had survived revolutions, political crises, assassination attempts, and personal tragedies beyond counting. When informed that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie had been killed, he reacted with surprising calm. "A higher power," he reportedly remarked quietly, "has restored the order that I could not maintain." Many around him were stunned by the coldness of the response. Yet Franz, Joseph, and Franz Ferdinand had never shared warmth or affection. Their relationship had long been strained by personality conflicts, political disagreements, and above all, by the Archduke's marriage to Sophie. Still, despite the emperor's calm exterior, the assassination shook the foundations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For years, Vienna had viewed Serbian nationalism as an existential threat. Now the heir to the throne had been murdered by Bosnian Serb conspirators connected to nationalist networks tied to Serbia. Within hours, many officials in Vienna already spoke openly of punishment. Some even spoke of war, far away in northern Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was sailing aboard his yacht in the North Sea near Kiel when he first learned of the assassination. At first, the message struggled to reach him. A smaller vessel approached the Kaiser's yacht repeatedly, attempting to deliver urgent news. Wilhelm, focused on his sailing activities, initially ignored the interruption. Only after great insistence did the approaching officers finally manage to pass him the message. When Wilhelm read the telegram describing Franz Ferdinand's death, witnesses later recalled that his face immediately changed. Only days earlier, He had visited the Archduke at his estate and spoken with him at length about European politics and Balkan tensions. Among Europe's rulers, Wilhelm felt unusually close to Franz Ferdinand. Both men often felt isolated. Both distrusted many politicians around them. Both believed Europe was entering a dangerous period. And now, suddenly, the Archduke was dead. Wilhelm reportedly became deeply emotional after reading the news. But beneath the personal grief, another realization slowly emerged. Germany had just lost one of the few major European leaders who consistently opposed a large continental war. In many ways, Franz Ferdinand had been one of the strongest restraining voices inside Austria-Hungary. Without him, Vienna's military hardliners would become far more powerful, and Wilhelm understood this immediately. In France, President Raymond Poincaré received the news while attending a horse race in Paris. Unlike Wilhelm, his initial reaction appeared far calmer. To many French officials, the assassination still seemed like a regional Balkan matter, rather than the beginning of a global crisis. In Britain, Foreign Secretary Edward Grey reacted cautiously. Like many diplomats across Europe, Grey still believed the situation might be contained through negotiation. Few leaders yet understood how fragile Europe's political balance had become. In Italy, reactions proved more complicated. Many Italians openly disliked Franz Ferdinand and viewed Austria-Hungary with suspicion despite the formal alliance between the two countries. Some Italian observers even privately described the assassination almost as a blessing for Italy's future ambitions against Austria. Across Europe, reactions varied. Shock, curiosity, sympathy, suspicion. But beneath all of them lay uncertainty. Nobody yet knew what Austria-Hungary would do next. And within Vienna itself, fierce arguments had already begun. At the center of these debates stood Austria-Hungary's foreign minister, Count Leopold Berg. For years, Berchtold had generally favored caution in foreign policy. He was not naturally reckless or openly militaristic. But Sarajevo changed him. The assassination convinced many Austrian leaders that Serbia had to be confronted once and for all. And among the loudest voices demanding immediate action stood General Konrad von Heetzen. Konrad had spent years arguing that Austria-Hungary must strike Serbia before it became too strong. Now, after Sarajevo, he believed his warnings had finally been proven correct. Again and again, he insisted that delay would only make the empire appear weak. To Konrad and many military leaders, Serbia now represented not merely a political rival, but a mortal threat. Yet not everyone inside the Austro-Hungarian government agreed. One of the most important opponents of immediate war was the Hungarian Prime Minister, Count István Tisza. Tisza feared that a war against Serbia could trigger a much larger European conflict involving Russia. And Russia, unlike Serbia, possessed enormous military resources. Tisza repeatedly warned that Austria-Hungary should not rush blindly into war without careful diplomatic preparation. But as days passed, voices demanding military action grew louder. Many Austrian officials now believed that failing to respond forcefully would destroy the empire's prestige forever. The assassination had transformed a long-simmering political crisis into something far more dangerous. Yet, even during these tense discussions, many leaders still failed to understand how close Europe stood to catastrophe. Most believed that any coming conflict could remain localized, limited, controlled. A short punitive war against Serbia. That illusion would prove fatal. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Russian officials watched events with growing concern. Russia viewed itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans, especially Serbia. Any Austrian attempt to crush Serbia completely could not be ignored politically inside Russia. Yet even Russian leaders still hoped diplomacy might preserve peace. For a few brief days after Sarajevo, Europe entered a strange period of uneasy calm. Governments discussed mobilization plans quietly behind closed doors. Diplomats exchanged cautious messages. Newspapers speculated endlessly about what might happen next. And ordinary civilians across Europe continued living their normal lives. People attended concerts. Families traveled for summer holidays. Cafes remained crowded late into the evening. Few realized that Europe was already beginning to move toward a catastrophe unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Because beneath the diplomacy, beneath the formal condolences, beneath the carefully controlled language of governments, the machinery of war had slowly begun turning. In the days following the Sarajevo assassination, Europe entered a tense and uncertain silence. Governments exchanged condolences. Diplomats spoke cautiously. Newspapers speculated endlessly about Austria-Hungary's next move. Yet beneath the formal language and ceremonial mourning, powerful forces were already pushing Europe toward war. Inside Vienna, arguments intensified rapidly. General Konrad von Hitzendorf demanded immediate military action against Serbia. To him, Sarajevo proved everything he had warned about for years. Austria-Hungary, he believed, had delayed too long already. Every year Serbia grew stronger. Every year nationalist movements spread further across the Balkans. Every year Vienna appeared weaker. Now the heir to the throne was dead. And Conrad insisted the empire had only two choices left: act decisively or slowly collapse. Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold increasingly moved toward the same conclusion. For years, Berchtold had often preferred caution and diplomatic maneuvering, but Sarajevo transformed his thinking. The assassination convinced him that Austria-Hungary's long policy of patience towards Serbia had failed completely. Many Austrian officials now believed that if the empire did not respond forcefully, it would appear weak before both its enemies and its own restless ethnic minorities. But one major obstacle remained: Hungarian Prime Minister Istvan Tisza. Tisza feared that a reckless war against Serbia could trigger a massive European conflict involving Russia. And unlike Serbia, Russia represented a true great power. Its army was enormous, its resources vast, its influence over Slavic nationalism extremely dangerous. Tisza warned repeatedly that Austria-Hungary should not rush blindly into military action without careful preparation and clear diplomatic justification. He insisted that Vienna first present Serbia with demands and allow diplomacy to proceed before considering war. Many military leaders viewed his caution as weakness. Yet Tisza understood something crucial. A local Balkan conflict might not remain local for very long. Meanwhile, Austrian investigators worked rapidly to uncover connections between the assassins and Serbian nationalist organizations. Interrogations soon revealed disturbing details. Several conspirators admitted links to Serbian networks, connected to military intelligence circles and extremist nationalist groups. Weapons and bombs used in the assassination appeared to have passed through Serbian channels. For Austrian hardliners, this evidence changed everything. Now they believed they possessed justification not merely for outrage, but for punishment. Yet even as Vienna drifted toward confrontation, one question mattered above all others. What would Germany do? Austria-Hungary could not risk war against Serbia if Germany refused support in the event of Russian intervention. And so, behind closed doors, Vienna began quietly seeking Berlin's approval. The man chosen for this delicate mission was Count Alexander Hoyos-Young, ambitious and closely connected to Austria's hawkish political circles. Hoyos traveled secretly to Germany, carrying documents explaining Vienna's position after his mission was simple: discover whether Germany would stand beside Austria-Hungary if conflict erupted. The answer would shape the future of Europe. When Hoyos arrived in Berlin in early July 1914, German leaders were still emotionally shaken by Franz Ferdinand's death. Kaiser Wilhelm remained deeply angered by the assassination. Many German officials increasingly believed that Austria-Hungary had to respond forcefully or risk losing prestige and authority entirely. Inside German military circles, fears about Russia continued growing stronger. Every passing year seemed to strengthen Russia militarily. Many German strategists quietly believed that if war with Russia was ultimately inevitable, then fighting sooner might actually be safer than waiting. These fears heavily influenced Berlin's response to Vienna. On July 5, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm effectively granted Austria-Hungary what historians later called the blank check. Germany promised full support, even if conflict with Serbia eventually pulled Russia into war. Even if Europe itself became engulfed in conflict, the promise was astonishingly reckless. Yet at the time, many German leaders still believed a wider war might be avoided. They assumed Russia would hesitate. They assumed France would remain cautious. They assumed Britain might stay neutral. Above all, they believed the crisis could still remain limited. This belief would become one of the greatest miscalculations in modern history. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, Austrian leaders felt enormously encouraged by Germany's support. The balance inside the government shifted further toward military action. Still, Tisza continued resisting immediate war. He demanded that Austria-Hungary first issue a formal ultimatum to Serbia. Its demands, he argued, must be so severe that Serbia would either accept humiliating conditions or reject them and appear responsible for the coming conflict. Eventually, this strategy gained support. Austria-Hungary would prepare an ultimatum unlike anything Europe had seen in decades. A document designed not merely to negotiate, but to corner Serbia completely. And while diplomats drafted demands and generals reviewed military timetables, Europe continued drifting through the warm summer of 1914 almost peacefully. People attended operas. Families vacationed beside lakes and beaches. Children played in city parks beneath the summer sun. Few ordinary civilians understood how dangerously close Europe now stood to catastrophe. Yet, behind government doors, military mobilization plans were already being studied carefully. Railway systems were examined, supply schedules reviewed, telegrams coded and decoded endlessly through the night. And slowly, quietly, Europe moved further into the July crisis, the most dangerous diplomatic crisis the continent had ever known. One built upon fear, pride, miscalculation, nationalism, and the growing belief among many leaders that war itself might solve problems that diplomacy no longer could. But even now, in early July 1914, very few people truly believed that the coming conflict could destroy an entire generation. By the middle of July 1914, Europe still appeared calm on the surface. Summer sunlight filled the cafes of Paris. Tourists crowded railway stations across the continent. Families traveled to seaside resorts and mountain villages, unaware that Europe stood only days away from catastrophe. Yet behind the elegant facades of Europe's capitals, governments were preparing for something far darker. Inside Vienna, Austrian leaders now focused on one central question: how could Serbia be confronted without making Austria-Hungary appear responsible for a continental war? The answer slowly emerged through diplomacy. An ultimatum, but not an ordinary ultimatum. This document would be crafted carefully to place Serbia in an impossible position, severe enough to provoke rejection, yet presented in such a way that Austria-Hungary could claim moral justification before Europe. The strategy satisfied many different factions inside the Austrian government. Military leaders wanted confrontation. Diplomats wanted legitimacy. Tisza wanted Austria to appear reasonable before history. And so, throughout July, Austrian officials worked meticulously on the wording of the demands. The process moved slowly and often bitterly. Arguments continued between moderates and hardliners. Konrad von Hetzendorf still pushed for immediate military action, fearing delay would weaken Austria's momentum. But others insisted that diplomacy had to create the appearance of patience and legality first. Meanwhile, another factor complicated everything further: timing. French President Raymond Poincaré and several senior French officials were preparing for an important diplomatic visit to Russia. Austria-Hungary feared that if France and Russia coordinated their response too early, Serbia might receive stronger diplomatic backing before Vienna could act. As a result, Austrian leaders delayed sending the ultimatum until the French delegation had departed Russia. Every detail became part of a larger calculation. Every delay increased tension further. Yet ironically, Austria-Hungary's own military structure also contributed to the delay. Many soldiers had been granted agricultural leave during the summer harvest season. Large portions of the Austro-Hungarian army remained scattered across rural regions, helping with farming work. General Konrad himself became increasingly frustrated by the logistical reality. Austria wanted rapid action, but the empire's cumbersome military system slowed everything down. And while Vienna delayed, other governments slowly began sensing that something dangerous was approaching. In St. Petersburg, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov grew deeply suspicious. Reports arriving from diplomats across Europe suggested that Austria-Hungary was preparing unusually severe measures against Serbia. Russian intelligence also intercepted diplomatic signals indicating heightened coordination between Vienna and Berlin. Sazonov began warning Russian officials that Austria might soon attempt to destroy Serbia politically or militarily. To Russia, this possibility was unacceptable. For years, Russia had presented itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans. Allowing Austria-Hungary to crush Serbia entirely would represent both a strategic defeat and a humiliation for Russian prestige. Yet even now, many leaders still hoped diplomacy could contain the crisis. In Britain, Foreign Secretary Edward Grey continued searching for ways to preserve peace through negotiation. Grey believed Europe's leaders were acting dangerously, yet he still assumed rational diplomacy might ultimately prevail. Few understood how rapidly events were escaping control. Meanwhile, Germany continued encouraging Austria-Hungary to act decisively. Berlin feared hesitation more than war itself. German leaders increasingly believed that delaying confrontation only strengthened Russia further. Many officials privately concluded that if a general European war eventually became unavoidable, Germany's position would only worsen with time. This belief created enormous pressure for rapid Austrian action. And so, while Europe's newspapers still discussed the crisis cautiously, the diplomatic machinery behind the scenes accelerated relentlessly. Drafts of the ultimatum passed between ministers. Military schedules were reviewed repeatedly. Rail mobilization plans expanded quietly across Europe. At the same time, governments publicly continued pretending that peace remained possible. Concerts still filled Vienna's opera houses. Crowds gathered beneath glowing streetlights in Berlin. Summer evenings in Paris remained warm and lively. Ordinary people still believed civilization itself was too advanced, too connected, too modern to collapse into a massive continental war. Many intellectuals insisted that economic interdependence made war irrational. Others believed Europe's leaders were too experienced to repeat the mistakes of earlier centuries. But beneath these comforting assumptions, fear continued spreading through governments and military headquarters, and increasingly, fear itself began shaping policy. Austria feared decline. Germany feared Russia's future strength. Russia feared humiliation. France feared abandonment. Britain feared losing control of the balance of power. Each nation viewed itself defensively. Each nation believed its actions were justified, and because of that, compromise became harder with every passing day. Finally, after weeks of preparation, Austria-Hungary completed its ultimatum to Serbia. The demands were intentionally severe. Some required Serbian authorities to suppress anti-Austrian propaganda. Others demanded investigations into nationalist networks. Most controversially, Austria insisted that its own officials participate directly inside Serbian judicial proceedings. To many observers, the ultimatum seemed designed not for acceptance, but for rejection. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary formally delivered the ultimatum to Serbia. Belgrade was given only 48 hours to respond. Across Europe, diplomats immediately recognized the danger. The July crisis had entered its final and most dangerous phase. Governments scrambled to communicate through telegrams and emergency meetings. In St. Petersburg, Sazonov reportedly reacted with shock after reading the Austrian demands. "This means European war," he warned quietly, and for the first time since Sarajevo, many leaders across Europe began realizing the catastrophe might truly be approaching. Still, even now, few fully understood the scale of what was coming. They imagined a regional conflict, a short war, limited mobilization. Almost nobody imagined trenches stretching across Europe for years, millions dead, empires collapsing, entire generations erased. Yet the machinery had already begun moving, and once Europe's great armies started mobilizing, stopping them would become almost impossible. After Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, Europe entered a period of mounting dread. Telegrams crossed the continent day and night. Diplomats rushed between ministries. Military officers reviewed mobilization schedules beneath dim electric lamps late into the evening. And slowly, the July crisis began transforming into something far more dangerous than anyone had originally imagined. At the center of this transformation stood Germany. For years, German leaders had watched Russia's growing power with increasing anxiety. Every military report, every railway expansion, every rise in Russian industrial output deepened the feeling that time itself was turning against Berlin. Among the most fearful voices stood General Helmuth von Moltke. Moltke believed that Germany's strategic position would only worsen in the future. Russia's army expanded constantly. French military cooperation with Russia strengthened steadily, and Britain, though officially distant, increasingly leaned toward the Entente powers diplomatically. To Moltke and many German strategists, the future appeared grim. If war eventually came, Germany might actually be stronger now than it would be several years later. This dangerous belief quietly shaped the thinking of Berlin's leadership during the July crisis. Yet Germany's leaders did not view themselves as reckless aggressors. On the contrary, many believed they were acting defensively. Germany feared Austria feared collapse. Russia feared humiliation. France feared abandonment. Every power believed its fears justified extraordinary measures, and this mutual fear slowly destroyed Europe's ability to compromise. Kaiser Wilhelm II remained emotionally shaken by Franz Ferdinand's assassination. He saw the murder not merely as terrorism, but as a direct attack against monarchy itself. To Wilhelm, revolutionary nationalism and Slavic extremism threatened the stability of every traditional European empire. And as Austrian diplomats pressed Berlin for support, Wilhelm increasingly concluded that Austria-Hungary had to act decisively against Serbia. Otherwise, the Habsburg Empire might begin unraveling completely. On July 5, 1914, Germany effectively granted Austria-Hungary unconditional backing. The infamous blank check. Berlin promised support, even if military action against Serbia triggered Russian intervention, even if Europe itself descended into war. At the time, few German leaders fully grasped how dangerous this promise truly was. Many still believed Russia would hesitate before entering a large war. Others assumed Britain might remain neutral. Some believed France would avoid direct confrontation. Above all, German leaders convinced themselves that the crisis could still remain localized. This assumption would become one of the greatest strategic miscalculations in modern history. Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg supported Austria-Hungary strongly during the crisis, though his motivations were complicated. Unlike some generals, he did not openly desire a massive European war. But he increasingly feared that Austria-Hungary's decline would isolate Germany strategically. If Vienna appeared weak after Sarajevo, Germany might lose its only reliable great power ally. And so, despite his private anxieties, Bethmann supported firm action. Yet privately, he often appeared exhausted and deeply troubled. The death of his wife earlier that year had affected him profoundly. Friends noticed his worsening insomnia, anxiety, and emotional instability during the summer of 1914. Europe's future increasingly rested in the hands of exhausted men burdened by fear, grief, pride, and uncertainty. And meanwhile, the machinery of mobilization continued advancing quietly across the continent. Railway officials prepared transport schedules capable of moving millions of soldiers. Military planners calculated how quickly armies could reach borders. Every great power feared being slower than its rivals, and this fear made delay itself appear dangerous. Mobilization timetables became almost sacred. Once started, they would be extremely difficult to stop. In Russia, Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov and other officials viewed Austria's ultimatum to Serbia as deliberately unacceptable. To them, Vienna seemed determined to humiliate or destroy Serbia entirely. Russia could not easily allow this to happen. For years, Russian leaders had presented themselves as protectors of Slavic peoples throughout the Balkans. Abandoning Serbia now would damage Russian prestige both internationally and domestically. And so, discussions about military mobilization slowly intensified in St. Petersburg. Yet even at this stage, many leaders still hoped to avoid total war. Some imagined limited mobilization. Others hoped diplomacy might still create compromise. British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey desperately searched for mediation proposals capable of slowing the crisis. Again and again, he urged Europe's leaders to negotiate before mobilization spiraled beyond control. But Europe's governments increasingly distrusted one another. Each feared appearing weak. Each feared losing strategic advantage. Each feared becoming vulnerable while rivals prepared for war. And as fear grew, diplomacy weakened. Meanwhile, ordinary civilians across Europe still struggled to understand the scale of the danger. Summer evenings remained peaceful in many cities. Cafes stayed crowded late into the night. Music drifted through open windows. Families continued traveling across Europe by train, unaware that those same railway systems would soon carry armies toward catastrophe. Many newspapers still spoke optimistically. Some predicted the crisis would end through negotiation like earlier diplomatic confrontations. Others imagined a short and limited conflict in the Balkans. Almost nobody envisioned what modern industrial war would actually become. Machine guns, artillery bomb, poison gas, endless trenches. The destruction waiting beneath Europe's calm, summer skies remained unimaginable. And still, the crisis accelerated. On July 25th, Serbia delivered its response to Austria-Hungary's ultimatum. The Serbian government accepted most demands, but not all. Some conditions, especially those involving direct Austrian participation inside Serbia's legal system, were rejected or modified. Many neutral observers believed Serbia's response was surprisingly Some diplomats later argued that the reply offered enough compromise to avoid war entirely. But inside Vienna, many leaders had already decided that confrontation must proceed regardless. Austria-Hungary broke diplomatic relations with Serbia almost immediately. Military preparations intensified further. Across Europe, governments now watched one another with growing alarm. The final opportunities for peace were beginning to disappear. And somewhere beneath the surface of every diplomatic conversation, one terrifying realization slowly emerged. Europe was no longer merely discussing war. Europe was preparing to unleash it. By the final days of July 1914, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. The last opportunities for peace were slipping away hour by hour. Austria-Hungary had already decided upon confrontation. Germany continued urging firmness and speed. Russia increasingly prepared to defend Serbia. France quietly stood beside its Russian ally. Britain still searched desperately for compromise, though fewer and fewer leaders believed compromise remained possible. And beneath all of this, millions of ordinary people continued, living their lives completely unaware that the world around them was about to change forever. Children played in quiet streets beneath the summer sun. Couples walked beside rivers and gardens during warm evenings. Families gathered at cafes while orchestras performed softly in the background. Europe still looked civilized, orderly, confident, but beneath the surface, the old world had already begun to crack. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the Sarajevo assassination, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The First World War had begun. At first, many leaders still believed the fighting might remain limited. Some imagined a short, punitive campaign against Serbia. Others believed diplomacy might still prevent wider escalation. But modern alliances had transformed Europe into a tightly connected system of fear and obligation. Once one nation mobilized, others felt forced to do the same, and mobilization itself became terrifyingly difficult to stop. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II approved partial military mobilization in support of Serbia. But military planners quickly warned that partial mobilization was nearly impossible within the complicated structure of Russia's enormous army. Soon, discussions shifted toward full mobilization. Germany watched these developments with alarm. For years, German war planning had depended upon rapid reactions. If Russia mobilized first, Germany feared losing the strategic advantage necessary for survival. And so, Berlin began issuing warnings. Urgent telegrams crossed Europe day and night. Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas cousins, who had once exchanged warm, personal letters, now communicated through increasingly desperate messages, trying to avoid disaster. Historians would later call these exchanges the Willy-Nicky telegrams. At moments, it almost seemed peace might still survive. Both rulers expressed fear. Both spoke of responsibility. Both worried about the consequences of war. And yet, neither fully controlled the forces now moving beneath them. Military timetables, alliance obligations, national pride, public opinion, fear of weakness. All of these pressures pushed Europe steadily toward catastrophe. Meanwhile, Britain still hesitated. Many British leaders hoped the conflict might remain continental and avoid pulling Britain directly into war. But one issue increasingly dominated British thinking: Belgium. German military planning relied heavily on the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy requiring German armies to move rapidly through neutral Belgium in order to attack France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize. To German military planners, the strategy appeared logical and necessary. But violating Belgian neutrality threatened to bring Britain into the war. And still, Germany prepared to proceed. As July turned into August, Europe's diplomatic system began collapsing almost completely. One declaration of war triggered another. Russia mobilized. Germany mobilized. France mobilized. Entire railway systems transformed overnight into engines of war. Millions of reservists received orders to report immediately. Train stations filled with soldiers embracing families goodbye beneath clouds of steam and cigarette smoke. Bands played patriotic songs in crowded city squares. Crowds waved flags. Many young men believed the war would end within months. Some even imagined they would return home before Christmas. Very few understood the scale of destruction modern industrial warfare was about to unleash. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, barbed wire, endless trenches stretching across entire countries. The modern world was preparing to destroy itself. And still, even as Europe collapsed into war, many leaders continued believing victory would come quickly. They did not yet understand that the conflict would consume empires: Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. Entire dynasties that had ruled Europe for centuries would vanish within only a few years. Millions would die, cities would be destroyed, and an entire generation would disappear into mud, smoke, steel, and fire. Yet in the beginning, it all still seems strangely unreal. The summer of 1914 remained beautiful. Warm sunlight still filled Europe's streets. Music still drifted through open cafe windows. Trains still carried travelers through peaceful countryside landscapes. And somewhere beneath that peaceful summer sky, Europe sleepwalked into the greatest catastrophe the modern world had ever known. All because of fear, pride, miscalculation, nationalism, and the belief that war could still be controlled. In the end, a single assassination, a single moment, a pair of gunshots in Sarajevo had pushed the world into chaos, and the old Europe, the confident, glittering Europe of emperors, palaces, diplomacy, and illusions of eternal stability, would never truly return again.